Good afternoon, everyone.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, I think we're ready to go now. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Our apologies for being a couple minutes late, but I want to start off by thanking you for joining us for SCAMP's Housing First workshop today. Our workshop today is going to be focused on what lessons we can learn from other cities who have developed different but equally effective housing first models and homelessness strategies. My name is Kelsey Brewer, and I am lucky enough to serve as a board member for SCAMP. I've also had the honor of serving as the moderator for today's panel. The wonderful staff at SCAMP has recruited some truly amazing speakers for today's workshop, including folks from the state of Utah and the cities of Denver and Houston. Our panelists will share the successes and lessons learned from implementing housing first models in their communities and how local cities, developers, and advocates like ourselves can build upon those models in our own backyard. The housing first model, in its most basic definition, simply means prioritizing moving unhoused people into permanent housing with optional wraparound treatment services for those who need them. But as most of us on the call know, the simple definition does not fully explain the many ways that different organizations and municipalities are approaching housing first. That's why it's important to learn how different communities are approaching the same end goal of getting unhoused folks into permanent housing with access to quality wraparound services. Today's agenda will start with a presentation from Mark Eckenbaum, Special Assistant to the Mayor of Houston on homelessness initiatives. Following Mark's presentation, Ned Ressinkoff, Policy Director for California YIMBY, will help contextualize some of Mark's comments and what lessons California should learn from the city of Houston. I will then take some of my moderator's privilege to ask Mark and Ned a couple of follow-up questions before moving on to Wayne Niedenhauser, who serves as the State Homelessness Coordinator for the state of Utah, to share how the state set up a unique governing structure to address homelessness. After I ask Wayne a couple of follow-up questions, we'll move on to Sarah Gillespie, who serves as the Associate Vice President for the Urban Institute. Sarah will share results from the Denver Supportive Housing Social Impact Bond Initiative. Quite a mouthful there, Sarah. I can't wait to learn more, including some positive results as it relates to public safety. After I ask Sarah a couple questions, we will open up questions to the audience. So make sure that all of those thoughts you're having throughout today's presentations, you're putting them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to them towards the end. So now that we know where we're headed in terms of today's agenda, I say, let's get moving. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mark and Ned to talk about Houston's approach to housing first. Mark?
Great, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and launch in. I want to thank the association for putting this together and for all the members that are joining us. So, this is just one way. This is the Houston model that I'll be talking about. Back in 2011, we went to Utah, and we talked to Salt Lake City, and we went to Denver. At the time, Denver was the poster child for reducing homelessness as well, and we learned from them. And it's just about taking lessons from others and then tailoring it to fit the unique characteristics of your local jurisdictions. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. I'm going to speak really fast. We're going to go through a bunch of slides. So let's go ahead and start. So back in 2011, we had the 6th largest homeless population in the country, with over 8,500 individuals on our streets and in our shelters on any given night. We were so bad, we were named a priority community by the feds. It's like getting your hand slapped. And it kind of woke us up that we need to do better. We should be demanding more. We should be expecting more. Next slide. And so we realized that we were just managing the issue. We were spending tens of millions of dollars every year managing the symptoms of homelessness. So that is, shelter, that is food, that is trying to provide services on the streets, that's clothing. But at the end of the day, we were spending all this money, but the folks were still homeless. And so we said we need to change how we respond to homelessness. Instead of managing, we need to be focused on solving the issue and solving the issue of homelessness. Next. So, the mayor at the time said, enough is enough. We're spending tens of millions of dollars every single year, and all we get is a parade of anecdotal stories from every organization. And we really want to be investing our funds where we can move the needle. If the strategy cannot actually move the needle, as in getting substantial reductions in homelessness that you can measure by the percentage, it's not worth our funds. We have a limited amount of funds. We have to invest wherever we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck. We're going to, like a private company, we're going to look at the ROI. And that's what's going to lead us to what interventions and what programs that we're going to support. But the lasered focus on putting our valuable resources and time into whatever is going to move that needle. Next. And so we said we got to create a system here. We said we got to actually not just a collaboration, but a true system where everybody plays a certain role. And so we said the two main features of that system is using evidence-based practices and those evidence-proven best practice of housing with unprecedented collaboration. Sometimes we don't like to use the word collaboration because it's a loaded term. Often I'll ask two CEOs of different agencies if they collaborate with each other, and they say they do. And then I ask them to explain, and they'll be like, well, we go out to lunch every other quarter, and we do a clothing drive during the holidays. What we're talking about is collective impact, where the day-to-day efforts and resources are finally coordinated and tuned with each other to maximize that impact. So you can see here down at the bottom, we used to have tons of organizations all working on homelessness, but they were doing their own thing, their own way, with their own goals and their own methods. And now we have a unified response system with one plan where over 100 different agencies are working on that one plan with a shared set of goals and a shared set of strategies. Next. And that homeless response system was what we call here the way home. As many of you are familiar with the term a continuum of care, the biggest amount of federal funds usually bypasses the city and the state, and it goes to the continuum of care. The city and county goes to the continuum of care. Our continuum of care plan is our regional plan. Our continuum of care plan is the city's plan. It is the county's plan. So we have one unified plan that everybody is a part of. Also, who else is a part of it? The private sector is a part of it. The ecumenical community is a part of it. The philanthropic sector is also a part of it. So we are all rowing in the same directions. I can't tell you the number of cities that I work with where the Chamber of Commerce is going in one direction, the county's in another, the city's in another, the homeless system is in another. In Houston, we're all rowing in that same direction because we don't have time to waste, and we have to maximize our impact, and we have to work together. To us, it's second nature. It's why we built it. It's how we built the first dome stadium. It's how we built a port 60 miles inland, how we put a man on the moon. We don't know anything different. So many cities are like, wow, everybody's really working together, and you have the heads of industry even working on this issue. To us, maybe it's because we've had 7 different federally declared disasters in the past 7 years, but it's what we do in Houston. Next slide. So we are unabashed supporters of Housing First. That is, next slide. And you guys know this. Tickets to a homeless person, arrest. Do we want to be arresting folks to be out the next day? Shelter, 98% of the folks on Houston streets don't want to go to a shelter. And sweeps, you're literally sweeping the people from one corner to the next corner. I'm preaching to the choir here. None of these things work. It cycles folks right back onto the streets they were. But housing, next, actually gets folks completely off the streets. Next. So, I don't want to knock any of the transitional housing providers. There is a role for transitional housing, very specific role, but by and large, we're focused on permanent supportive housing because we have to get rid of these traditional barriers that keep folks out of housing. So, hey, I got a place for you, but you can't smoke, you can't drink, you can't have coffee or caffeine, you have to go to these classes every single day, you got to do, X, Y, and Z. If I was on the streets for an extended period of time and somebody was telling me I couldn't smoke, I'd be like, I'll just go back to the streets. So removing all those maybe well-intended rules, but they act as barriers in keeping folks on the streets. So we get rid of all those. And what's nice is too, typical transitional housing has an expiration date. And that person is back trying to find a magical landlord to lease to them, which may have been the reason why they were homeless in the first place. Now they're signing their own lease and they can stay there. So the shelters have a very important role because they are the front door into our housing system. but the shelters are not the answer. We are a housing-based system. We're not a shelter-based system, but shelters do have that role. And it's all about individual choice. We're not doing that because it's what the most progressive thing to do. We're doing it because the data shows us what's the most effective. And that's why we're getting 85 to 90% of the folks on the street saying yes to going to housing. And that's how we're able to keep them, 90% of them housed 2 years after their original placement. In fact, when we let the people voluntarily engage with the support services, we find once again, there's not only a much higher uptake in the support services, but it ends up being more effective at the end of the day. And then in Texas, this is important here. It's fiscally conservative for us to pay with the housing and the wraparound services than it is to merely drive by them on a homeless individual on the streets. So your number one cost is going to be emergency room costs, let alone cleaning up all the streets and the jail costs and the shelter costs. When we can cut those costs by up to 70% by actually putting the person into housing with those wraparound services. We will never house somebody without the services. You guys know this very well. The services is what keeps person housed, and the housing is what makes the services effective. Next. So we set out to create a ton of new units from the ground up. Then we have the support services that gets linked to that. And then while every local jurisdiction has to use coordinated access, we brought that to scale. And that's the only way to get folks referrals into housing for the homeless. That allows us to have a method to the madness and to get accountability numbers and to assist housing providers that may be struggling in their recidivism rate. And so it's kind of like a Priceline Expedia here. It's a 20-minute housing assessment, real-time, web-based, and from there we can do the real-time referrals, wait lists, and so forth. Next slide. The city is actively educating folks, but we're not just doing it ourselves. We're doing it with community leaders. We're doing it with the private sector. We're doing it with the county on what homeless housing looks like. This is not homeless housing. This is a lineup outside of a shelter. Next slide. Like you guys, when the city invests in it, it ends up being Class A properties. We want to make sure to add to the communities, not detract to the communities. And these are just some examples of the permanent supportive housing communities that the city has invested in Houston. Next slide. We don't have enough time nor money to build from the ground up. So the vast majority of our units are scattered site, spread throughout the region. Some of these are all market rate apartment complexes. And our primary way of funding here, we put no local general fund dollars from the city. I do not recommend that. We're the only major city that doesn't put any local dollars in. And so we had to get smart. And so that's part of the reason why we coordinate and use best practices. But we primarily use housing vouchers. Both of our housing authorities, the cities and the counties, are major players. They provide a preference for individuals experiencing homelessness through our homeless system. And that's the vast majority of the way we pay the rent. Some of these we might have 1 unit, some we may have 20 units. We will do what we can get. Both the city and the county fund, through our lead agency, the Coalition for the Homeless, a landlord liaison team. Their entire job is to go knock on doors and to get units to be a part and problem solve if landlords are having problems. Their job is to cultivate those new units that we need to get people off the streets. Next. We work with our apartment association. The mayor does call to actions to landlords and management companies to be a part of the solution and to partner with the city, the county, and our homeless agencies. Next. Some of the examples of the integrated services are provided to folks once they're housed. They get a case manager. The case manager then coordinates the services that they need tailored to their specific needs. Next. This is an example of the end of our coordinated access, where it'll show different housing programs if the client is eligible for them, as well as it might show if they take animals or pets, and we can do those real-time wait lists and referrals. And here is some of the benefits. In the first 4 years of starting, so we started this in 2012, and so in the first 4 years, we had a 76% reduction in our chronic homeless population. This is not because of correlation. This is direct causation between a massive increase in housing and housing folks and being able to get that net reduction. Obviously, we have to house more people every month that are homeless than are becoming homeless to get that net reduction. Next. So since 2012, we have permanently housed more than 28,000 individuals experiencing homelessness. Next. That it has done, excuse me, this is a 63% reduction. I apologize for that. You can see that in overall homelessness. Their largest major city to hit functional zero to effectively end veteran homelessness, and making major strides in chronic and family homelessness. What is not also up here is major reductions in domestic violence amongst our homeless population because of our ability to house folks. Next. So the blue line is the overall, the gray line is the street, and the orange line is the shelter. We used to have more people on our streets than in our shelter. In that first year of starting this, between 2012 and 2013, you'll see where that orange line and the gray line cross. So by our housing, we were able to now have more people in our shelters than on our streets. And that we've never looked back, even during the pandemic. Now, how did we do that? Did we do that by building more shelter and putting more people into shelter? But the answer is no. What we did was we just housed a lot of the people that were on the streets and put them into housing. And that's how we were able to get these numbers to switch. You can see a big reduction in homelessness through 2016. We had our first increase in 2017. That was because of Hurricane Harvey, where nearly 20% of our homeless population was homeless because of Harvey. And then we kind of plateaued out, needing additional resources. For us, we have a system. We have a fine-tuned motor that can house lots of people very quickly. We just need the gas and the resources to make it happen. There's a lot of places that may have all the resources in the world, but if they don't have that system, then it's all going to be for naught. For us, it's the other way around. Well, because of COVID, we got those federal resources, and the city targeted those federal resources to housing our homeless. And that's what is in that green box, which equated to a 19% reduction in homelessness, including a nearly 10% reduction in our street count during the pandemic. Next. So this is just comparing other cities in Texas. These cities spend a lot more money than Houston does. I wish we had their resources. But what we are that's different is we're a housing-based system. And when I mean everybody's involved, I mean everybody's involved. The mayor's leadership team on homelessness originally included the cardinal of the Catholic Diocese, the president of the Houston Texans, the head of the Episcopal Diocese, the CEO of the Houston Endowment, one of the largest in the countries, the head of Camden, the founder of Camden Properties. Literally all the bigwigs, everybody was concentrated, lasered focus on this issue. And so at the end of the day, it's not always how many people you're serving. It's not how many, it's looking at how much money you're spending and what are the results for that. What is the impact? And if you're not getting the impact, then we got to look at what we're spending. One thing is that we are not afraid to prioritize. So there's probably tons of different housing providers on here that serves all different types of clients. One thing we did in Houston is we really concentrated on homelessness and on one subsection of homelessness. For instance, veterans, and then chronically homeless. And then once we get major reductions in that, it frees up resources to go to the next bucket. The temptation is to put a little bit of money into every single issue, but you're spreading the resources so thin that you're not going to get any major impact. And here we're prioritizing, we're concentrating, we're targeting our financial resources so we can achieve that impact. Next. This is comparing to other cities in the country. So, you can look at that later on. Next. So here are some key principles, and I'm going to go through this because I'm probably going over time. So next. Utilization doesn't equal impact. It doesn't matter. So many times people might build a new shelter and they're like, it's being 100% utilized. Yay! But the question is what's the impact? Is there a reduction in your street count? Is there a reduction in your overall count? So for us, it's not about services or programs being utilized. It's at the end of the day of what is the actual direct impact of those programs that are being funded. Next. We have a one-track mind here, and that's housing. Obviously, you still got to do some management of the issue while you're working to house people. But what I tell folks all the time is for every dollar that goes into managing the issue, you need to do, tenfold at least into solving the issue. Next. And here's one reason why. To put folks into shelter costs money. And then to get folks out of shelter, usually into housing, costs money. What if we took all that money and we just put it into the housing? And that allows us to do more of it and focus more on the long-term permanent solution than just the short-term ones. Next. Hit the button 3 times. Okay, so too often, a lot of the ideas out there are that red area. That's the temptation. It is high PR, but low impact. This is your shower trucks that go out. This is your sometimes your tiny home villages. It's housing. We love that. We just believe in bringing it to scale. It's your we can go through all those ones. The green there's less of. These are high impact. They're good, but they're low PR. Building a collaborative system is not that sexy front page material for the newspaper. Now, the holy grail is something that is both high impact and high PR. There's not very many of them. It's what we're doing right now in Houston. It takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of patience and it takes a lot of time. Next. But things that are high PR aren't always high impact. Once again, be focused on the impact. Public-private partnerships is a bedstone of what we do here in Houston. I work most closely with the head of the economic development office for the city. He opens up his Rolodex. He and the mayor both do meetings with landlords, with developers all the time, trying to get folks to be involved. We will lay out the red carpet. We will try to fast track permitting, code, and everything that we can do to try to get more housing. It's not enough just to be affordable housing. It has to be accessible housing. We can have all the affordable housing in the world, but if our clients cannot get in because of their challenging backgrounds, then it's not going to help us reduce homelessness. So public-private partnerships is the bedrock. Next. My salary was first paid for by Chevron, and we get a lot of private support, and even our management districts are part of it as well. I've not seen a city that's been able to get reductions without elected leadership taking a key role in this. But it cannot live and die with that elected leader, because when there's a switch in leadership, that's when regression can happen. So you have to have, in my case, a mayor really take charge, take the reins. But at the same time, we're institutionalizing a lot of our changes. So when he's out at the end of the year because of term limits, that we can continue on. Next. The issue can seem so insurmountable. It's just breaking it down into targeted, digestible pieces and accomplishing it one by one by one. Next. This is the Houston mantra here. We move fast. We do a little bit of planning. We move fast, and then we apologize last. So this is a issue. You cannot get paralyzed in planning. You have to do planning. You know, we did a 4-day community charrette with 300 folks. And from there, we said, we're going to do housing and we're going to do a collaborative system. What we didn't do is hold 30 community meetings and spend 2 years of having everybody sign it like it's the Magna Carta at the end of the day. We're wasting precious time. The need is now. It's going to only get worse. Move fast, modify as needed. You will have to, we are all okay with building the ship as it is sailing. Next. If we can't bring it to scale, we're not going to focus our attention on it. So tiny homes is great. Here in Houston, we take tiny homes, we stack it on top of each other to bring it to scale, and we call them apartment complexes. We don't have the time, we don't have the money. We got to be focused on what we can bring to scale. Next. And the last here is a culture of yes and barrier busting. As everybody here knows, there's 1,000 reasons why things can't be accomplished, especially when it comes to housing. And when you meet with housing departments, they're going to say, well, this regulation and this code and this thing. I ask folks in the city of Houston, if they say something can't be done, to come up with 2 solutions around it. So we all have to see ourselves as barrier busters, because this is really challenging, difficult work. Next. This is an example back in 2017. Big takeaway here, 80% of our funding went into housing that was going to homelessness. This does not include the vouchers. Next. And this allowed us, here's that COVID money I was talking about. We were one of the first to take COVID money, not put folks into motels, but put folks directly into housing. Next. We started off with a 2-year goal of housing 5,000 people, and we housed 7,000 people in the first 14 months. This is a joint project between the city and the county. We're lockstep on this, teaming up with our coalition and our housing system. It's utilizing permanent housing as our infectious disease control response to COVID. Next. That red line is where we would be without these dollars. The green line is where we were. Geez, this was even a year ago. Much higher now. Now, we are now facing the same issue of it's difficult to find housing units. So we're offering more incentive dollars. We're trying to do gap while landlords are waiting for vouchers to kick in, providing gap funding, we're doing a ton of things. I know you guys are doing too. We are now feeling the housing crunch like the West Coast has felt for the past decade. But we are looking at doing conversions of motels and hotels. We're throwing wet spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks. Next. This has also allowed us, as part of this, to decommission encampments through housing. Next. And I'm almost done. So in the past, we tried decommissioning in a large encampment by spending 3 months offering housing and housing everybody at that encampment. But at the end of that 3 months, all the tents were still there. Why? Because of something called backfill. We housed most of those people, but since we did it over 3 months, new people moved in. Next slide. So what we do now is we house everybody in 1 week. Now, the reality is sometimes it takes 3 to 4 weeks of prep work, but to the public, they see folks there, and in less than 5 days, the entire encampment is gone. Where did they go? Did we displace them further into neighborhoods? No. Did we put them into jail? No. Did we sweep them onto the next corner? No. We put them into housing. These are our two options. Day one, that plan A, we are moving folks literally from the encampment into a housing unit, and we can or that plan B is we take the entire encampment, move them to the housing navigation center as one community, and then we house them out of that navigation center one by one as units become available. We are still getting over 85% of folks willing to go to the housing navigation center because they can go with their buddies. It's low barrier, and they know it leads to housing. We have next slide. So here are some examples. This is downtown. People called this cardboard city. Where did everybody go? Housed. Next slide. This is a roundabout onto the freeway right behind City Hall in downtown Houston. 53 folks. Where did they go? Once again, we put them into housing. So we did not have anybody digging in and making a last stand at the end of this, because everybody, vast majority of folks went voluntarily into housing. Next slide. Once we decommission it, the public health and safety issues are prevented from re-emerging at that location. So this is almost 60 encampments have been decommissioned with nearly 350 people in them. 90% of those individuals have gone to housing. And so as folks that do this business know, there's tons of reputational risk. There are legal landmines. There's political pressures. And at the end of the day, we want this to be effective policy to actually help out these vulnerable individuals. The way we're doing it here is not only the most compassionate way, it's the most effective way. And we've been highly successful, and the mayor's goal is to decommission all of our encampments through housing by the end of the year. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Ned, we'll go ahead and go to you, and then we'll do a couple quick questions, okay?
All right, great. Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Technical difficulties, apologies. All right, can everyone see that? Great. So yeah, thanks to SCAMP for having me. Always love talking to a group of practitioners, and thanks for Mark for that great previous sort of firsthand account of what's going on the ground in Houston. I kind of see my presentation as just a little add-on or epilogue to his, where I'm going to talk about some of the background conditions in housing policy in Houston and in California that have made Houston's approach a bit more successful than California's. So first off, just as a sort of level setting exercise, this probably won't be a big surprise to anyone in this presentation or in the audience, but homelessness is a housing problem. Why has homelessness been going up in California? Simply because housing in California is far too expensive. And that's really what these two charts are intended to illustrate. They're part of the real wealth of research that we have demonstrating that this is the case. On the left, you can see a chart from a 2018 Zillow study that shows the link between housing affordability and rates of homelessness when on average, people are spending about a third or more of their income on rent. You can see that homelessness starts to increase at a rapid clip. And then on the right, we have this chart from an excellent book from which I borrowed the title of this slide, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, that I think really illustrates that the issue is not just, it's not just housing cost, but housing cost as a function of limited housing supply. So what this shows you here is that the lower the vacancy rate in a particular city, the higher homelessness is likely to be in that city. And that's really key, because one of the common myths that you hear in California is that, oh, well, we have more than a half vacant housing to actually house our entire homeless population. And so really housing supply is not the issue. And what we can see here is that's incorrect. Cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, the state as a whole, actually have very low vacancy rates. And the vacancy rate is really just a sort of indicator of housing demand or the sort of supply-demand mismatch. So the lower your vacancy rate, the fewer homes you have available for people who are demanding housing, the higher the cost of housing is going to be driven up, and the more homelessness you're likely to have. So this presentation is based on a report I did a few months ago in December called Housing Abundance as a Precondition for Ending Homelessness, where I really compare California and Houston. And in this section, I want to talk a little bit about why I chose Houston for that comparison point, besides just the obvious fact that, as Mark pointed out in the previous presentation, Houston has had really remarkable success reducing homelessness over the past decade plus. So I'm trying to compare here point in time counts between San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Houston over the past decade. So I say by more than 50%, but as you know from the previous presentation, if you look at since 2008, when Houston first adopted its current strategy, we're really talking about more like 62% reductions. But the point remains that if you compare over that time period, San Francisco and Los Angeles to Houston, you'll see that San Francisco and Los Angeles have been seeing these consistent increases in homelessness over the same period that Houston has seen really quite dramatic reductions. This is despite the fact that since the beginning of the pandemic, there's been billions of dollars poured into the homeless services system in California. And the homeless services system, as you all know, follows a general sort of housing first model. The fact that homelessness has continued to climb despite those investments has led some pundits to suggest that maybe housing first is the problem here, and that we should be trying a more punitive approach or a treatment first approach. A most prominent example of this is probably the book San Francisco by Michael Schellenberger, which I don't know if any of you have read it, but I have, and I can't really recommend it. But what we see here, and I mean, what Mark pointed to in his presentation, is that if the problem were really housing first, then we would not be seeing these dramatic declines in Houston at the same time we're seeing homelessness increase in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Because not only is Houston also committed to the housing first model, I would argue it's more consistent in its application of the model than many California cities. So that kind of brings us to the real question that I structured this around, which is what is the real difference between what's happening in Houston and what's happening in major California cities. Now, there are a number of different things that are significant differences between Houston and some of these other cities. And I think Mark illustrated a number of the different things that Houston does in terms of funding, in terms of coordination, allocation of resources that are really key to their success and that a lot of California cities aren't doing. But since I'm from California YIMBY, I really want to talk about the land use policy context in which all of this is taking place. And the land use policy context is that while cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, major global cities, but 75 to 80% of their residential land area is turned over to single family only zoning. And also in San Francisco in particular, all of the permitting is discretionary, which means that even if you propose a building that sort of fits the zoning, building codes, design standards, everything, then the Board of Supervisors can still kill it or veto it for whatever reason they want. Houston has a very, very different land use model. They don't have a traditional zoning code. They do have deed restrictions in many neighborhoods that operate as a quasi zoning code, but it's much easier to build housing, and so building gets built faster and at a lower cost in Houston than it does in San Francisco, Los Angeles, most other large California cities. And you can see the results right here on the left, which is that during this period, Houston's population grew by about 2 million, the Houston metro area, that is, while the populations of San Francisco and Los Angeles grew at a much slower rate. And Houston was still building about 3 times as much housing per capita as these other cities. And this isn't just deed restricted affordable housing, but market rate housing at really all income levels. The result of this, which you can see on the right, is that despite Houston's rapid growth, the median rent for a 1-bedroom apartment is much, much lower than it is in large California cities. The one exception that I note in this chart is Bakersfield, where rent is even lower than in Houston, and that's important because Bakersfield is one of the real success stories in California when it comes to housing first, actually, where they've been able to house a lot of their unhoused population at a time when cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles are still trying to bring those numbers down. So this is really the main takeaway from the report and my research on Houston, which is that housing first absolutely does work at reducing homelessness, but you need an ample supply of housing at all income levels in order to make it work at scale. And what I mean by work at scale is, as Mark said, make the outflow exceed the inflow. Make sure that you're housing more people than there are entering homelessness on an annual basis. So what is the importance of abundant housing in Houston? How does it sort of operate on the homeless services system? Well, there are 3 main reasons that housing abundance is so important. And the first is simply inflow. If you have a city like San Francisco where you're not building enough housing relative to population increases and wealthy residents are bidding up the cost of housing, then that is going to increase the rate at which people enter homelessness and make it very difficult for the homeless services system to catch up. And in fact, San Francisco's Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing has said that 4 San Francisco residents become homeless for every 1 who they're able to house. The second thing is housing acquisition and development. So in order to implement housing first, obviously you need housing. And that means as a homeless services system, you need to contract to build housing, acquire housing, or make deals with landlords. And that all becomes significantly more difficult in a housing constrained environment. The cost of land goes up. Landlords are less likely to want to work with you because they have a bunch of higher income tenants who are applying for their units. And then there's also all of the permitting issues and zoning issues that permanent supportive housing is not exempt from in California or really in anywhere else. The same tools that NIMBYs in a place like San Francisco or Los Angeles can use to grind market rate housing to a halt, they can also use to grind the production of permanent supportive housing to a halt. And I can tell you from having seen it up close that if you think building an apartment building in a residential area in California is hard, it is 100 times harder if it's permanent supportive housing. And then the last point I want to make here, and this is what the chart on the right is about, is the supportive services element of Housing First also becomes more challenging in a housing constrained environment. And that's simply because if you're going to have wraparound services, then you need qualified individuals who can provide those services. You need social workers, you need housing navigators, and those folks need a place to live. You'll see on the right that while a frontline worker's salary on average is a bit higher in San Francisco than it is in Houston, it's not 3 times higher. And when rent costs 3 times as much in San Francisco, what that means is that you are burning people out faster, people are moving away faster. And from talking to some of the nonprofits that run the Housing First services in San Francisco, I can tell you that they realize that some of the people that they're employing to be social workers with the unhoused population are themselves severely cost burdened and potentially at risk of homelessness themselves, which I think is just absolutely unacceptable. Raising the income of those wraparound supports and services workers will get you part of the way, but we also need to bring down their cost of housing to make sure that we're not burning people out and to make sure that these services are going to be adequately staffed. So Houston's recipe for success is really the things that I was talking about before. So by right permitting, lack of a traditional zoning code. And then I would also point to a couple of other things that are really key from Mark's presentation, which are the fact that there's really a high level of coordination and collaboration in Houston compared to what tend to be the extremely fragmented homeless services systems in places, especially like Los Angeles. I think in some ways Los Angeles is the worst offender, but really across the state. And then the other thing is that in Houston, they have long-term funding commitments. And in California, a lot of the funding that has been recently freed up for our homeless services systems is one-time funding. And in fact, now that we're entering a structural budget deficit in the sort of out budget years at the state level, there's a risk that quite a bit of that funding is going to dry up over time. And so the chart on the left is, I think, really the most important chart in the report. And it shows the cost of housing one previously unhoused individual in San Francisco versus in Houston. And that includes both housing costs and wraparound supports and services. As you can see in both cases, the housing costs make up the bulk of the cost. But in San Francisco, the cost of housing one individual is just much, much, much higher. And that really has a deleterious effect on San Francisco's ability to house as many people as it should be housing. I mean, the key issue here is that no matter how much you increase funding for San Francisco's HSH, you're still going to have at some point a finite number of resources. And making sure that you can provide a high level of care, a high level of housing and services at a manageable cost is going to be really key to actually scaling this up to the point where we're able to house everyone who needs to be housed. So with that, just briefly, a few recommendations. One is that California should have an ongoing funding stream for Housing First programs. We should also continue to eliminate restrictive zoning and permitting rules that negatively impact housing supply and affordability. And in particular, I think also increasing subsidies for the creation of extremely low income housing and permanent supportive housing is really important, but also streamlining the production of those housing types, but really streamlining the production of housing across the board, and in particular multifamily housing. getting closer to really having a sort of collaboration statewide that Houston has metro area wide by enforcing local compliance with both housing first and state housing goals. And I think really linking those conceptually, making clear that if a city is not serious about building enough housing for all its residents, then it's not serious about reducing homelessness. Granting the state interagency council on homelessness more coordinating authority, mandating more local coordination, and then last of all, at the state level, putting in protections to really curb ineffective and punitive encampment sweeps or encampment bans, and focus on the sort of encampment closures that actually lead to long-term positive outcomes, which means getting everyone in those encampments into permanent housing. All right, and with that, I'll turn it over to questions. Thank you very much.
All right, so I've got a couple quick questions here. I'm going to do one for Mark and then one for you, Ned, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. Mark, I had different questions for you, but I've been trying to follow the chat and the Q&A, and everybody has a lot of questions specifically about kind of how you funded all of this. I know you went into a little bit of detail on the presentation, but can you talk about the challenges that you face maybe with as it relates to project-based vouchers, and then more specifically, how you provided services and ongoing rental assistance without using those local tax dollars? Where have those funds come from, and what could we look for maybe in California to be able to try to model something similar?
Yeah. So I think Ned was spot on with everything, and there's not one silver reason why Houston and others aren't. For us, zoning may be helpful, because then we'd be able to make waivers for density and height if folks would actually include supportive housing or affordable housing. We don't have those tools to play with, unfortunately. But at the end of the day, one issue is that we don't have the funding. We are literally funding from one disaster to another disaster. So we have enough COVID dollars to keep us going for about 2 more years. At the end of those 2 years, we have no idea how we're going to continue to support our system. Are we going to perversely hope for another, natural disaster so that we'll get some disaster funds in? But we don't have a voter approved tax increment like LA or Miami, a food and beverage tax, or we don't have a big bond initiative here. And so we're really trying to figure that out. What we do, because we don't have those local general fund dollars going in, I would not suggest that. We spend the least amount of money than any major city on homelessness. I would not suggest that. But what we've done is we target the federal dollars that we get in. So when you look at all the federal, so a lot of times we have from 4 different funding entities, 30 different grants, and they all have their own requirements, restrictions, timelines, and we do the really hard work of braiding all those together. So sometimes the city may say, I got this grant, I can use it for housing, but not the services. And the county says, well, I got this grant, I can use it for services, but not for housing. Well, we got a marriage, we got a match, let's team up. And that's the braiding that we do. We're concentrating those federal funds. So the rent is primarily, not completely, but primarily paid for by vouchers from our housing authorities with a homeless preference. The services are paid with the continuum of care dollars that come in from the feds. And then we are funding some different housing programs and housing navigators and assessors and all that through some of the entitlement grant funds. Those are your CDBG funds and your ESG funds. And we're going to try as much as possible to invest our home dollars into the bricks and sticks of building it up. Or in some cases, we're also doing some rent payments through rapid rehousing. So it's a method to the madness. It's a dirty sandbox to be in, to braid all those funds together. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, but that's what we do as a community, and our lead agency is really good at that. And they jump in that sandbox to get that done.
Well, and what strikes me from your response is the only way that this works is the fact that you are all extremely coordinated with kind of one objective, one goal. And that leads me to my question to Ned. You called out in your research the fact that that coordination is really lacking in California. And naturally, where my question went to when listening to Mark's responses, do we have to have that coordination at the state level, or is there some coordination that we could be looking at on a more regional basis in LA or city-based, or just the way that things are set up in California? Do we really need that coordination to be coming out of the state as well?
I think it needs to be coming at all levels. I think that there is certainly more that local governments can do in order to compel coordination. And I think one of the things that's been really important in Houston actually is political leadership, and the mayor in 2008 who really pushed through the current system in Houston. More political leadership at the local level in a large cities, and really saying, okay, this is the entity, whether it be a public entity or a contracted nonprofit entity, that is in charge of the homeless services overall system, and it's going to bring these other people to the table, I think is really important. But I also think that given that this is a statewide issue, given the amount of money coming down from the state to localities to deal with this issue, and given the fact that it's connected with the housing crisis, intimately connected, and that we have a huge collective action problem on housing in California, I also think that statewide coordination is really important.
Okay, awesome. Mark and Ned, I could talk to you guys about this. I might call you after this actually to keep talking about it. But thank you so much for your presentations. We are going to go ahead and move on to our next panelist. Wayne from the state of Utah, thank you so much for being patient as we get to you, and I will turn it over to you to hear your presentation.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you, Mark and Ned. Those are great presentations. I have lots of questions that I might reach out to you on. We're trying to tackle this a local problem with state coordination, just as this discussion, just as we ended this discussion with the other two presentations. So next slide. So the Office of Homeless Services, my position, the State Homeless Coordinator, was established in the 2021 session of the legislature, House Bill 347. It created a State Homelessness Council. We could see that the services, the departments on a state level needed to have more coordination. For example, workforce services here, Health and Human Services, both fund the same organizations, the same nonprofits out there, but we don't know what each other are funding. That's just one example of how coordination needs to happen. The emphasis of the bill was to coordinate, to create policy, and to address this from a more regional level, a state level. It is a local response, but the states, the counties need to be there to be supportive of those local responses. So we might be a little bit unique this way. We have 3 continuum of cares, unlike the big states like Texas and California. Utah has about 3.3 million people total, about 2.2 million along the Wasatch Front, which is Salt Lake area. But we have 3 COCs, and I think every state probably has a balance of state continuum of care. We have a balance of state, has 25 counties, but we've split those up into what we call local homeless councils. So they function a lot like a COC, but they do locally. Because what happens down in southern Utah in what we call Washington County, and what happens up north in the Bear River counties, completely different. The weather's different, the environment's different. And so we have local homeless councils, and our office supports those councils. We give support with staff, with funding, and with help in coordinating Health and Human Services and the other resources that the state has. Next slide. We've also created what's called the Utah Homeless Network. These are providers and people that are involved in the local homeless council on a statewide level, and they help determine policy for homelessness in the state from a provider, from a local kind of boots on the ground approach. And at this point, I might just interject that just a little bit of my background. I served in the legislature here in Utah for 12 years. I was in the Senate from 2006 through 2018. And 6 of those years, I was the Senate president in the state of Utah. We address issues from A to Z. But we took on homelessness in 2017 and 2018. And so I had a little bit of background in this. But I left the legislature. And then in 2021, after this bill was passed, the governor called me and asked me if I'd come back from the private sector to take this on in the state. And initially I said, no, I didn't want to do that. I'm happy in the private sector. I'm a real estate developer by trade. We create housing and have done so in my company for 30 years. So I know the housing industry very, very well. But one of the first things I did in this position is I knew I didn't know. And that means I had addressed this on a policy level. I understood a lot of the systemic problems, but I didn't know what the root causes of homelessness were. So my wife and I, we know a lady, and she goes out every Friday night and spends about 2 or 3 hours with people that are experiencing homelessness. They're unsheltered in an area of Salt Lake City. And we asked if we could join her. And we went there the first night and we kind of got hooked on that. Now, nobody there knows other than this lady that we go with that I'm the state homeless coordinator. But we spend every Friday night for about 2 or 3 hours in the bitter cold and sometimes in the heat in the summer here in Salt Lake, visiting, eating with people that are experiencing homelessness, trying to understand their stories. We've visited them in jail. We've tried to get them into treatment, into housing, into shelter, and we know their stories. We understand a lot of what's happened to those individuals, why they're in a homeless situation. And there's a couple of takeaways that I have from my actual experience with people that are unsheltered, and that is, let's go to the next slide and I'll explain it with this slide. First of all, there are a lot of, one of the messages that I'm taking to the state is that homelessness is a community condition and it's going to take community to remedy it. And every community is a source of homelessness. What is your community doing to, what are they going to do to prevent it and treat this most difficult condition? So we have a lot of cities that think that it's just Salt Lake's problem or Ogden's problem or St. George's problem because they have a response system there. But every city is a source of homelessness. And there are cities that respond or trying to respond, and there are cities that are content with to let others take care of the situation. We got to change that. Let's go to the next slide. So now these are not HUD definitions. These are Wayne's definitions from his experience on the ground. We have an acute homeless population, and we have a persistent homeless population in Utah. And just a couple of data points just to explain what I mean. In 2021, 17,500 people accessed homeless services that were reported to HMIS. In January of 2022, our point-in time count statewide was 3,600 people. 75% of the people that stay in emergency shelter are there for less than 90 days. 53% of those that stay in emergency shelter are there less than 30 days. And 31% of those individuals are there less than 7 days. There are a lot of people that get into homelessness, but either self-correct or our systems help them get back into housing, get back to regulating, get back into a lifestyle that's sustainable for them. But there's a persistent homeless population out there. And I've had opportunity to talk to at least 100 of them, and 50 of them I know very well. And without fail, they've been in housing multiple times. They've had chances for housing, but they're still unsheltered today. They've been in treatment multiple times. sometimes a lot. And most of them have had incidents with the law enforcement system and have been in jail, sometimes multiple times. This is the most difficult population that we deal with in society. Let's go to the next slide. So housing is paramount, as has well been articulated so far today. This is something I figured out kind of on my own initially, but I'm a developer. I'm a real estate developer, and so I started to figure out how we can create permanent housing, a sustainable model, something that will last for a long time. And the key elements of housing are you got to build it. Well, let's take advantage of the opportunities and resources that we have now, like low-income housing tax credit. That will provide about 75% of the capital to purchase and renovate or to build new housing. If you use a 9% credit, and this last session of the legislature, which just ended last Friday, they created a state LIHTC program that will actually help create more of this affordable housing. It doesn't provide all the funding for the housing, but housing that is for this most difficult population, housing that that's deeply affordable, 30% AMI and below, it has to have support. It's been well articulated also. If you don't have the services, the housing doesn't work. Utah was a pioneer in housing first. A lot of people have come here to see what we're doing. I think it's not been a great success. If you go to some of those permanent supportive housing places, people feel unsafe because there's drug deals going on in those housing situations. There's hoarding in the rooms. They're filthy. And a lot of people that are on the street today and unsheltered, they've been there. But it didn't work for them. But I have concluded just through that experience, through some study, that the services, the support wasn't there for those individuals. And so the housing didn't take. If we want a sustainable long-term model for dealing with some of the most difficult situations out there, we're talking mental health and severe behavioral health issues, you gotta have the support. And it just can't last for a certain amount of time. Some people will need that maintenance probably most of their life, maybe the rest of their life. So how do we fund the services, the housing? Well, Medicaid can be a big part of that if you have the right waivers. And we're working on those here in Utah, where housing services now can be part of that Medicaid response. But it's still not enough to give to provide all the money for the services. And that's why we need to have housing that has very little debt service that doesn't need to service an equity position. And then having rent support, these vouchers, which we don't have enough of vouchers. We got to have more rent support to create the rent flow to support the housing and enough rent flow to even flow into services. That's 24/7 staff, sometimes mental health and behavioral health caseworkers there on a continual basis if you really want to address people in this situation. Let's go to the next slide. A couple of key successes that we've had here in Utah so far is we did get $55 million for deeply affordable housing last year. Our office went to work. We got those grants distributed. That'll be 679 new units. This is a supply side solution. We've created what's called the Impact Partnership. You should go onto that website. There's a video there that explains what happens there. This is our philanthropic community. The billionaires, the millionaires here in Utah have gotten together into a partnership. They work closely with our office in coordination of funding. We've revised our state strategic plan. that link there will take you to our plan. We just finished that here in the last month. And then we've also created what's called the Shelter Cities Mitigation. So every city will give money into the mitigation fund, and then that's distributed to cities that have a shelter response system. We'll go to the next slide. Some of our successes this year in the legislative process, $50 million for deeply affordable housing. We did a Utah low-income housing tax credit, that $60 million program. Of course, Texas and California numbers like 10 times this, but this is Utah. Housing stabilization grants, we got $5 million ongoing for rental support. We're going to put that to good use. We're going to show the legislature what we can do with that and come back for more. We implemented a statewide Code Blue system where the health department, a non-political body, will declare a Code Blue, which will allow facilities to open up when it's 15 degrees or below, when we have a severe weather situation. We've had a few of those this winter. We're also requiring larger counties that don't have a plan to get a plan in a bill we passed this year, and we got additional $12 million for provider money. Let's go to the next slide. Things that we want to do going forward is implement our strategic plan, more deeply affordable housing, implementation of the sequential intercept model. This is the Miami model. We're going to use Salt Lake County as a pilot. Non-congregate shelter. The people I meet with out on the street all the time, one thing that's is common, they are dealing with high anxiety, a PTSD type of thing. And the first thing we ask them is to go in a shelter and sleep in a room with 50 people. It's little wonder why anybody wants to go there. But having a non-congregate shelter response is key. And then, of course, dedicated funding streams. That's going to be a sustainable model. We are working on a couple of those for local counties to enact through a local option and through some state funding. That's a little bit about what's happening here in Utah. Again, our numbers are going to look pretty small, but it's a significant issue in our state. And I'm a real estate person. The three most important things in real estate are location, location, location. The three most important things in what we do is coordination, coordination, and coordination. That's a key element to the success of our homeless systems in the state.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wayne. I really appreciated the emphasis on traditional affordable housing, those that are serving folks 30% and below. I think it's one of the things that we struggle with is we're putting a lot of effort into the permanent supportive housing front. It's where a lot of our resources are going, that we're sometimes missing that opportunity to stem it off. So my question, if you can just address it really quickly, is as you've started to focus more and more on some of those key points that we see on the screen, can you talk a little bit about some of the unanticipated challenges that you faced when implementing these directives? I think the theme of today's call has been about coordination and buy-in from multiple groups, and I'm curious as to how you've accomplished that or continuing to work to accomplish that.
Yeah, well, I could tell you a lot of stories of how difficult the situation is, and that surprised me completely. I thought I'd come into this position and, hey, we just offer housing and everything's going to be great. And I focused on housing. And then, you know, I realized really early on that from a developer standpoint, deeply affordable housing will not naturally happen. It will never happen because it will never attract capital because it doesn't pencil. We have to have these programs like rent support, deeply affordable housing grants, and combined with services if we're ever going to make any long-term progress with this. So those are some of the things that were kind of a shock to me, but we've come to a realization what those issues are, and we're now trying to tackle those specific issues and make them better here in Utah and help our local response systems function better.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wayne. So we're going to go ahead and move on to Sarah because we're running out of time here. These presentations have just been so good. So Sarah, I'm not going to do an introduction for you. Feel free to just take it away.
Yes, great. I'm Sarah Gillespie from the Urban Institute. I'm going to talk about results from a finished evaluation of a permanent supportive housing first program in Denver. We shorthanded call it the Denver SIB. It stands for the Social Impact Bond. I'm not going to talk about the social impact bond financing part of this project, which is super fascinating. We just don't have time for that today. But I'll give you my contact information so you can follow up later. But I'm going to talk about the results because I think hearing my the presenters who went before me, what I think my presentation does is going to give you a lot of great data to back up everything you've been hearing today. So the Denver SIB, as I said, we called it, was a permanent supportive housing program. It operated, well, the evaluation operated for 5 years from January 2016 through the end of 2020. The program is ongoing today, right? But our evaluation was for 5 years. The program targeted about 250 people, and it hoped to house people who were experiencing chronic homelessness and who had frequent interactions with the criminal legal system and emergency health systems. And the theory was that if we could help folks stabilize in housing, that would reduce their interactions with those systems. And so very important to this project was the housing first approach, which aimed to get people quickly out of homelessness and into housing without any requirements. So there were no required services, no preconditions, not even any additional eligibility criteria, which we'll talk more about. There were the eligibility criteria for the program, but beyond that, the program committed to house folks no matter what. That's the overview. So we go to the next slide. So who was the program trying to house? People who had at least 8 arrests over 3 years and were homeless at the time of arrest. So that is people who are cycling in and out of jail. They're not going to jail. They're not going to prison for long periods of time. They are frequently going to jail for pretty low level offenses and cycling in and out of jail. We created the eligibility list based only on data from the Denver Police Department. So I want to note here that this is unique, right? Because we didn't have a shelter requirement. We didn't even have, we didn't create the list based on any homelessness utilization data. It was all based on the arrest record. And so this list initially was about 1,400 people. We refreshed that list 1 or 2 times a year. And by the end of the evaluation, that list was almost 4,000 people who met this really high number of arrests in a pretty short period of time. Once the providers engaged with someone on this list, again, the list only meant that they had this number of arrests. The providers ended up engaging with over 700 people off of this list. Less than 5 did not meet the definition of chronic homelessness. So again, I just want to point out, we did not create the list based on any HMIS data, but everyone essentially met this definition of chronic homelessness. And I think that's an important point here. And the next slide shows you, there's a lot of talk about the link between the criminal legal system and experience of homelessness. And when we looked at the type of offenses in this target population, by and large, it's what we call quality of life offenses, right? Offenses that are related to the experience of homelessness, like public intoxication, trespassing. And that's what these blue squares show here. The blue squares represent those quality of life offenses. And on the left side, you see people who met the criteria for this program who are experiencing chronic homelessness. Most of their offenses are quality of life offenses. When we look at other people who did not meet the criteria for this program, but were still being arrested in Denver, a much lower share are for these quality of life experiences, right? And you don't see this when you look at crimes against people, crimes against property. You don't see this overrepresentation in people experiencing homelessness. On the next slide, again, just a bit more data to show you how this cycle between homelessness and jail works. The people who are represented in blue represent people in the target population who were related for these who were arrested for these quality of life offenses 2 years in a row. So again, these are folks who are cycling. It's not people who are being arrested and then moving on somehow. This is very much a cycle that is happening year after year. And then the next slide, again, I'm throwing a lot of data in these slides. You can take these slides after. I think it's helpful for folks who are trying to make the argument for the need for housing for this target population. We looked at the amount of time that police in Denver spend policing offenses associated with homelessness. There are hours, the 2,700 hours related to arresting folks for these quality of life offenses, folks who are experiencing homelessness, plus the time they go out on warrants, right? So one of the previous presenters talked about when someone experiencing homelessness gets a ticket, they don't show up in court, then there's a warrant for their arrest and the police have to go, execute that warrant. So lots of time that police spend with folks experiencing homelessness. So the point of the program was to find a better way. So if you go to the next slide, our evaluation enrolled people in a randomized controlled trial. And this is important because an RCT is the gold standard for research. So a lot of you on this webinar are going to agree with everything you see. You knew this, you always knew this, but having a randomized controlled trial is a very compelling way for a lot of policymakers to feel sure, right, that this is an evidence-based practice that is grounded in rigorous research. We had people in the treatment group who were offered access to the supportive housing program, and then people who met the exact same criteria, but there wasn't enough supportive housing, so they were in the control group. What was available to people in the control group looks a lot like emergency shelter. On the next slide, we tracked a lot of data. I saw some questions in the chat about this. So something that was really impressive about this, I told you the list was created based on arrest data only. So the service providers got a list of names and the last address at which they were arrested. And that's all they had. And they had to go out and engage folks. They had to find them, they had to engage them, offer the program, use a lot of motivational interviewing, all the techniques that you all are familiar with to engage people in the program. And we tracked how long it took to do each of these steps from the very beginning to the time they were in housing. And we also tracked how many people moved from step to step. And so overall, of all the people who were randomized to that treatment group, 79% were located, engaged, and housed. That's really successful. From a list of names and street addresses where they were arrested, that's very successful. And you can see the time to housing. Again, that one of the longest periods of time was just locating people. The next longest was housing application. But in general, there was a pretty good time to housing. So then let's talk about some of the results. On the next slide, after 3 years in the program, 77% of participants remained in stable housing. That was 86% at 1 year, 81% at 2 years, 77% at 3 years. Not many studies go beyond 1 or 2 years. So that's another way that this evidence kind of adds to the field of what we know. Most exits were because of death. We're going to talk about that a lot. This is a very medically vulnerable population. I'm sure all of you know this, have experienced this in your own work. We're going to talk more about that, but a lot of the exits we saw were due to death. Next slide. So people in the program received far more housing assistance and spent fewer days in shelters on average. So this is kind of a no-duh slide for a lot of people. If you're in the program, you're going to get more days of housing assistance. But what I always like to point out, that blue bar for the control group shows that if you're not getting access to supportive housing, there's not much other housing assistance available, right? It's very hard for folks in this target population to navigate the system outside of a program like this and find access to housing assistance. Folks who were not engaged in the program were not finding other housing assistance, right? We were looking at the state of Colorado to understand access to other types of housing assistance, and we just weren't seeing it happen outside of this type of program. On the next slide, this is the big criminal legal system outcomes, and these are all statistically significant. Pretty big reductions in police contacts, arrests, and jail days, 34% for reduction in police contacts, 40% reduction in arrests, 27% reduction in jail days. And again, these are statistically significant. When we talk about the randomized control trial being the gold standard, we can say without a doubt that we see these reductions because of the supportive housing and not because of anything else. Our groups look the exact same on every characteristic that we can observe. And the only difference is that one got access to housing and the other did not. On the next slide, we looked at visits to detox. And so we do want to see a decrease in this because when the detox we're looking at here is city funded short-term, think of it like a sobering center, right? It's not long-term follow-up substance use treatment. That's what we want to see go up when people get connected to housing. This is really more like a transport to a sobering center. And we did see a significant decrease in that and a decrease in EMS response. And then on the next slide, again, what we did want to see was a decrease in emergency department visits. We saw 8 fewer ED visits per year for people in the program, and we wanted to see a big increase in office-based healthcare, which we did. We saw 155% increase in office-based visits, 29% increase in unique prescription medications, so people getting connected to care. And remember, this was a Housing First program. There were no requirements for services, and we still see a huge increase in access to services, which is a big key about, the theory of change behind housing stability comes first and then the services. On the next slide, like I said, mortality was high in both groups. This is the hard truth about the vulnerability of this population. There was no difference between the group. We did look at the causes of death. The only significant difference we found was the exposure. Folks in the control group were dying of exposure, whereas folks in the treatment group were not. There were other causes of death that were related to chronic health conditions like end-stage liver disease and kidney disease, things that, unfortunately, even 2-3 years in housing was not able to turn around. This is something that we're really interested in continuing to look at. And then the next slide, my next to last slide shows cost savings. We looked at the cost of the program versus the cost avoided by the decrease in these outcomes I've been talking about. And approximately half of the total per person cost was offset by avoided costs from these outcomes. And then my last slide, I know I'm talking so fast. So the last slide is just some takeaways. What big questions we always get asked: why was the SIB successful? Things I wasn't even able to talk about today, but quality implementation. I could give an entire presentation on the quality of supportive housing implementation in Denver. The precise targeting, which I did talk about, making sure that the highest need, the folks who were the most frequent utilizers of the jail and the ED were targeted, is another reason you see impact. And then collaboration across so much of the city and county stakeholders. We also say a big takeaway is that the SIB offers evidence that busts a lot of myths that we commonly hear. So housing stability is possible for highest need individuals. These are folks who are cycling in and out of jail, are using the ED. We have an entire paper that looks at the behavioral health diagnoses among this population. Housing stability is possible for those folks as well. And homelessness does not drive violent crime. Yes, we see this link between homelessness and the criminal legal system, but it is, by and large, those quality of life offenses because of the experience of homelessness, not because folks are committing violent crime, crimes against people or property. Housing is not just a housing solution. Clearly, the SIB shows that it's also a criminal justice solution. It's a healthcare solution. Housing First is not housing only. This is a big one. There was a significant increase in access to services, whereas the people who were not in the program were not getting that same connection to services. And then better outcomes for taxpayer dollars, right? So there was a huge offset. This is a very intensive intervention. It's not a cheap intervention, but it offsets many of the more negative outcomes people would otherwise experience. So I will stop there. I know I flew through that, but always happy for you to contact me afterwards.
You did a great job, Sarah. That was a lot of information for like 12 minutes. So I do know that we are at 2:30. As long as the panelists are okay, I'm hoping we can maybe go about 5 more minutes. I see Sarah nodding. Okay, I think I've got enough from everybody. So I am going to just pitch out these questions for anybody to kind of take them. They were directed a lot at Mark, but I think all of us can probably speak to some of them. One of the most common questions was, what do you do when people refuse services, when they're out there, when it's offered? And I'd be happy to have you guys take that question at face value, give maybe some tactical responses, but also if that's kind of a myth around people who are experiencing homelessness and that refusal of services, feel free to attack the question that way. I am going to go ahead and have us start with Mark, and then Wayne, Ned, Sarah, if you guys want to jump in after that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So what we found, it is a myth that the vast majority of folks, when they are placed into housing, we're at 99% of folks voluntarily engage with the support services that are provided. What they don't want is they may not want to engage for shelter for various reasons, some of it legitimate, some of it not. They don't want to make it feel like they're in a penitentiary being in housing with archaic rules that nobody would be wanting to live under. Having a baseline of rules that any tenant, whether they're formerly homeless or not, has to follow is fine. There's tenant rules. It's not the Wild West. But when there's wraparound support services provided by professionals, then folks do want to engage, and they engage successfully. And once again, the services is what keeps people housed.
Thank you. Wayne, I think your mic's off, so.
And there's one thing, I'm sorry, Wayne. One thing, we'll get folks that will refuse services when it's provided on the streets. And that's because there's so much going on and folks are worried about where they're going to sleep and are they going to be safe and where they're going to get their food. It's hard for somebody to fully engage and want to voluntarily engage in support services when they're living on the streets. That's why housing first is so important. Let's get them to be in a safe and stable environment first, so that then they can fully and successfully engage. Sorry.
Thanks, Mark. From actual experience, I experience resistance on a frequent basis when I'm out on the streets among the unsheltered population. There's probably a lot of reasons for that, but we never give up. You always show compassion, and you're always there. And eventually, somebody's going to be ready to accept housing or whatever they need to regulate, to stabilize.
Sarah, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I was just going to add that from the time someone was located, taking data from the SIV, to the time someone said, yes, I'll move forward with this program, was about 2 weeks. And those providers were talking to folks every day of those 2 weeks. So it's not you ask and they say no and you're done, right? I mean, it is an sustained engagement, and that's on average. There were some folks who took months to decide to engage.
Excellent. And then Ned, I'm going to throw this one over at you too, but again, rest of the group, if you want to jump in. The other theme that kind of came out of the Q&A box was this idea of, we're addressing folks that are on the street, we're addressing the chronic nature of homelessness, but are we maybe losing a little bit of the idea of people who are on the edge or at risk of falling in? And what kind of discussion or questions should we be asking to make sure we're not totally focused on one area at the detriment of another?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to first just tag on really quick to the previous responses, all of which I agree with. But I wanted to add that this is the importance of being able to have a real mix of different housing typologies that you can offer people. So that, I mean, one of the issues that we face in San Francisco, for example, is that all of the permanent supportive housing, or the vast majority of it, is concentrated in one neighborhood. And you need to be able to have, as they have in Houston, a broad geographic distribution, but also different types of housing to make sure you're meeting everyone's needs. To the question about, I think what's often called prevention, and people who are housing insecure. I mean, I think this is where the issue of broad-based housing affordability becomes really, really important. Just making sure that you are driving down the average price of rent citywide to something that is affordable to working class and lower income people. And that means building more deed restricted affordable housing, yes, but it also means that you need to have an ample supply of naturally occurring affordable housing, because you're never going to produce so much deed restricted affordable housing that the majority of low income or housing insecure people are living in it. 90% of people who are low income or very low income live in market rate housing. So you need to make sure that the market rate housing is affordable as well. But I also think that there are some different experiments with subsidies that are going on that are also important. I mean, for people who are very, very low income, you'll never get rents for market rate units down low enough for people who are making like $20,000 a year in a place like San Francisco or less. And so that's where subsidies come in. And so I know that there are some interesting experiments in places like Oakland, California, with shallow subsidy programs to see if those can prevent homelessness. I think those sorts of interventions are pretty important and worth experimenting with to get the targeting and the amount that's actually needed to get someone stabilized in housing exactly right.
Mark or Wayne, you guys want to jump on that one at all, or? Okay, I'm going to take the silence as we're good to go.
I think Ned got it.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all to our panelists, Sarah, Wayne, Ned. I really, really appreciate the amount of time, and Mark, the amount of time that you gave us today. This was so amazing. I think we could have done individual webinars on all of the different models and probably had a really great conversation. I'd also like to thank everybody who bared with us at the beginning, starting a little late, and bared with us at the end, ending a little bit late. SCAMP is always doing our best to make sure that we're providing these educational resources for all of our members and everybody in the community. So thank you so much for being here. They will send out all of the slides today and a recording today. So if you have any additional questions, feel free to follow up with us. But thank you so much. And that's it.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.